Welcome to my TikTok friends, the podcast about the app where everyone goes viral. My name is Dan Vadabonker, and I'm going to start this episode with a sincere apology in the most Canadian fashion. It's actually a threefold apology. First, to you, the listener, to anybody who had subscribed to this podcast and had been listening to the conversations I was having with my TikTok friends and enjoying this podcast for what it was. I apologize that I did not continue posting. It's been quite a long time since I last posted an episode, and I'll get into a little bit why in a second, but I do want to apologize because I feel bad about that. I have this kind of underlying guilt for not continuing the podcast, and I feel like apologizing will help me assuage that guilt. So I am very sorry for that. I also want to apologize to my guest for this episode, Bryan Patrick Stoyle. He is an awesome TikTok friend, and I've interviewed him twice in the last 2 years for this podcast, and both times his episode has fallen by the wayside as a result of my poor mental health. So I'm so sorry, Bryan, that this has happened twice with your interviews. You're such a great friend, and you're such an interesting person to talk to, and I really enjoy our conversations. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for being on the podcast, and I hope I can have you back again. And the third part of my apology is to myself, because I feel that I didn't give this podcast a chance and I didn't believe in it. The reason that I haven't been posting and the reason why I've started and stopped again with this project is because of my poor mental health. I've been struggling very deeply with depression over the last year. And anyone who has depression knows that when you are struggling with it, you just don't feel like doing anything. And that's what would happen. I would focus on the little minute details about the podcast and how few people were listening. You know what? It's just you feel helpless, right? You feel like you can't do anything. And so that has been my life for the last year, is just kind of being paralyzed in a lot of different ways in my life. Fortunately, I feel like I've been able to turn a corner on that. And I liken it to the scene in Jurassic Park where Laura Dern's character is like activating all the power. Remember, Samuel L. Jackson has to talk her through the part where she's like turning on all the power in Jurassic Park, and the powers is going back on. Over the last few months, I've been taking the time to really focus on my mental health. I've been going to therapy. I changed my medication and really been thinking about my life and reassessing things and where things are going. And as I kind of recover and as I start to feel more like myself with the medication change, I feel like those switches that Laura Dern is turning on, the power is coming back on, like in Jurassic Park, right? Turning those switches one at a time, and more, I'm feeling like myself. I don't know if this analogy is holding true, because after that, the dinosaur pops out and scares the shit out of everybody. But anyway, I love Jurassic Park. It's such a great film. This conversation with Bryan Patrick Stoyle is actually from almost a year ago when Bryan was on strike as part of the actors' strike. You know, we had the writers' strike, the Hollywood writers' strike, and then the actors' strike. And Bryan was a part of that. He is an actor based out of New York, not Hollywood necessarily, but he is still a member of the union, and he was on strike. So as a result, Bryan was not able to talk about all the awesome fandoms like Star Wars and Ghostbusters and all the things he posts about on his TikTok. And I'll put his link in the show notes if you want to give him a follow. He's just a super cool guy, and he posts lots of great content. But Bryan and I have a really great conversation about that situation and about what the actors were looking to get out of it. And I think it's interesting to listen back to this a year later and just reflect on what the actors did end up getting out of that deal and what has happened since. And I think I want to have Bryan back on the podcast to talk about the state of Hollywood, the state of, movies and television in general, and how AI is affecting all that, and how the studios have all kind of become a little bit gun shy at this point to put out new and exciting content. Bryan and I also talk about his experience recording an audiobook. The book is called How We Stopped the Destroyers, and the audiobook is available wherever you get your audiobooks, so Audible, or I downloaded it on Spotify actually. And it is a super awesome sci-fi book. This is like right up my alley. It's like an epic sci-fi kind of space opera kind of a thing. And Bryan does all the voices. I think he said in the conversation he did like something like 26 different characters for this. And there's awesome production. There's special voice effects and audio production. And it's just a great audiobook in general. They've really upped the game of audiobooks these days. It's not just a guy reading his book. They've got real production going on with this kind of stuff. So this is really, really good. And I highly recommend it. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to download it for yourself. Without further ado, here is the interview with Bryan Patrick Stoyle. you are on strike, correct?
I am on strike, yes.
How's that going?
It's interesting so far. So I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA. I am not a member of the WGA, but obviously a lot of our entertainment industry has crossover. There's a lot of people who are dual members if they write and act, and I do write, but not at the union level yet. So there is a lot that we are also asking for in both unions that are very similar, our demands. Since our demands are so similar, a lot of solidarity has been in place where SAG members were on the picket lines earlier on when the writer's strike started in May. Obviously, a lot of times our strikes now are sort of conjoined together ever since we went on strike in July. We've had solidarity rallies. We've had a lot of crossover. Right now, I know the WGA is in some sort of negotiations with the producers, but the studios, I should say.
Right.
It's the AMPTP. Really, it's more the studio executives than it's the actual people who produce films, which is a separate union. Not that that's confusing to the layperson at all. But
Well, I was hoping you could kind of explain it a little more simply, and you have. That is a pretty good way of putting it. But what are your demands essentially? Like, what are you looking for in the new deal?
there's a lot of different things. The primary thing that comes up with most, union negotiations, and these happen every 3 years. For the contracts that are on the table right now, these are negotiated every 3 years, very deliberately. Most of that'll come up with pay raises. So we want to set in pay raises, and the big thing right now, obviously, most people who have been paying attention to the economy the last few years, there has been a lot of inflation, higher than usual rates. So we wanted our rates for pay raises to reflect the inflation that we have gone through over the last couple of years. And that varies from year to year. So it'll be year one, we want this percentage of a raise, year two, this, year three, this. The two largest talking points for our demands, which I think are the biggest hot button issues, and also the two things that I think that the AMPTP is going to bristle on and have bristled on, will be the use of AI as far as consent, as far as usage for our likenesses, as far as where they can get away with using that technology versus, still allowing actors to work. There was an early proposal that got a lot of traction on social media where there was a proposal for the producers or for casting companies to have an actor come in for one day of work, scan their image, and then use a digital double of that actor for the rest of the movie shoot or TV shoot or what have you, which for a movie shoot is very rough because that could be several days of work that you are then not getting. And for a TV show, that could be an entire season's work or multiple seasons worth of work that you are no longer getting if you've only been scanned once and then no longer needed.
Yeah, and it really devalues the work, right? It just like, what are you reducing this person to a computer image? Like there's so much more to it than that. And
Oh, of course.
it's so frustrating. When I remember that got a lot of play online, and I remember hearing about that deal, and we're like, come on, if this is where their head's at, it's going to be an issue. But another part of it, I think maybe this plays more to the writers than for you guys, is the issue of the streaming era, royalties, right? I guess that would matter for you, right? You would get royalties as well. That seems to be a sticking point. I don't know, what's this whole thing about Netflix doesn't pay royalties, or do you know? Can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, of course. So royalties or residuals, as we tend to call them a little bit more industry internally, we get paid those based on the usage of the work. So when you're first contracted for a job, whether it be a TV show, movie, commercial, whatever it is, less so with commercials for this particular, because commercial contracts are not in negotiations for this strike, but for film, television, other on-camera work, you are paid your rate for like days of work, or if you're a higher paying celebrity, whatever the rate is for the movie, whatever that's negotiated at. And then there are residuals based on when something is used again. So let's say that you're in a movie, that movie plays in a movie theater, then it goes to streaming or home video if this were a few years ago. If this were playing on television, you would get residuals for that because they negotiated the usage of that movie to go play somewhere else. And that is not just the actors, but the writers as well, the director, the producers. This is everybody. They get just a little bit of extra money because they negotiated that it costs money to license that movie out for that usage on that streaming service or onto that television platform. in an airline, whether it's being reused for, a re-release. Let's say we've had a couple of science fiction movies have anniversary re-releases over the last several years. That's extra money being made. That's extra money being paid out in residuals. The problem with streaming services. Now, a lot of these shows and movies are being made on a certain contract with SAG-AFTRA known as the New Media Agreement. Now, that contract was created right around the time that web series, digital media was first being created. So we're talking like 2009, 2012, that kind of spectrum of time. And this was a way for SAG, which was initially just for anything shot on film. So there became a whole issue there 10 years ago with digital television and movies being shot on digital. Thank you, George Lucas. For different people that are using a different medium that wasn't film, which is why we have SAG and AFTRA merging to be the combined actors union that it is today. When that happened, we had the New Media Agreement, which allows for web content. And streaming services, when they were first getting started on creating new content, which was only about a year or so after this contract's invention, used that contract because it was content made for the internet, a streaming service. So in its most broad technical usage, it's accurate. Now, the spirit of that contract is for somebody who has a camera and wants to create some content and make something for YouTube, or back in those days, something like a Funny or Die or a different kind of website. That was the kind of envision that contract being used for. So they offered lower minimums of payment. They offered lower rates of residuals. Your larger streaming services have used that contract. Some would say they have abused that contract. I would say they've used it in the most technical way possible. I don't think it's necessarily abuse, but I definitely think that it is a situation on a business side that they knew they could have probably afforded to pay more for, but wanted to make it for as inexpensively as possible to maximize their profits, which is a business move.
What you're describing to me, like the first thing you described about scanning the actor's face, that devalues the work. This is the value of the work. This acknowledges the value of the work over and over again. Every time that work is shown, every time that work is paid for, then everybody involved gets a piece of that, right? That's what that is. And so that's why it's so important. And just regarding the whole Netflix thing, I think the big, I'm going to get on a rant here. The big thing is the landscape has changed so much. So yes, initially Netflix was initially like a DVD service, right? You would mail the DVDs and stuff. I actually never did that, but then it became streaming, and we did stream it on our laptops and computers and such at first, because that's where it was. Those of us with the technical know-how figured out how to put it on our Xbox and that kind of stuff. But it now, of course, there are Rokus, Fire Sticks, Apple TVs, all these really easy to use devices. Our TVs, every single TV you buy just comes with an app library on it, right? So it's a completely different landscape. And it's right. And every time you boot these things up, guess what? You see, the first thing that pops up, because it's sponsored, is Netflix, Disney Plus, all these streaming services, right? So it's completely changed. They have dominated. It's become a landscape that they have dominated, and it's got to change, right? Because it's shifted. And you're right, it's not intended for that. It's intended for little web series. Those awesome little, remember LARPs? That was an awesome series. There's lots of great little series like that on the internet. Chad Vader, that's another great one. I used to love that one. Right, that's the kind of stuff it was talking about. It's not talking about big productions.
Absolutely. And there are wonderful people in our unions who have gotten their start or got their break from those contracts. I mean, if you look at someone like Issa Rae, she started making web series after web series. She got very famous off of one, The Misadventures of Awkward Black Girl. And then she went on and got these deals with HBO to make shows like Insecure. Now she's in multiple movies. She's in many this summer. I mean, she is all over the place now because she was able to produce lower budget content on that contract. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who can afford to pay more. Maybe they couldn't when it first started, or at least, had a lower budget to work with at the beginning. But now they're obviously in a much better position. Like you've said, the market has changed a lot over the last decade plus.
Mm-hmm.
Things were very different in 2013 than they are today. And also their model is a little bit different from traditional television. In the US, we have the Nielsen ratings, and I'm sure there's a very similar metric for measuring ratings in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But in the streaming services, they may monitor those numbers, but they don't offer them publicly. And they also have their whole business model for the last several years until very recently modeled almost entirely after growth, after getting more subscribers in versus who's watching individual products. So their whole business model hasn't even been about tracking these numbers for the sake of distribution and what have you. And if you actually like took the time to crunch those numbers, I think that would paint a very different picture of what people would be owed for the work that they have been put in and has been enjoyed by that subscriber base.
Yeah.
The problem is that information is being held very close to the vest by these streaming services.
They only tell you when they want to. Like they said, I think they said that Ahsoka got 14 million streams or something like that. Of course, they're going to brag about the big numbers like that, but they're not going to tell us like what Willow got. I'd love to know what Willow got for streaming, right? Mm-hmm. That'd be an interesting number to see. But yeah, but the thing is, it builds faith in the medium. That's why we have Nielsen ratings in those numbers, because it measures that people are actually watching, and it reassures people that it matters, that people are actually watching this thing, and that it is a medium that people trust. So it's such a weird situation. Well, I'm with you. I honestly, okay, and I come from a place, Winnipeg. The whole union movement was born here in a way. There was a strike here. I think it was the first strike. I keep hearing about it. I should know more about it than I do because I'm from here. But there was a strike in 1919 that was a major thing that really galvanized the whole union movement. And we are in the middle of strike city right now because our liquor store workers just got a deal. They were on strike for a month and a half. And our insurance workers, these are all public employees that work for the government. We have a very conservative government right now that has not been kind to unions for the last 6 or 7 years. So there's a whole thing happening right now between the unions and the government. It's very interesting. But I always support the unions. I am in the union as well in my other job as an instructor, and we almost went on strike as well. That almost happened. But we didn't, thank God, because I really wanted to get back to work.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of the little joke meme online about hot labor summer, but it's so true. I mean, there's so many unions that are, negotiating their contracts right now, or threatening strike, or on strike, or very narrowly missing strikes in every country. So it's fascinating to watch that transformation, and it's great to see that support, because you never saw that before in the days before social media was so prevalent, because you would always hear about it in the news, which is, not to speak ill of the news media. They do really great work a lot of the time, but they are controlled by larger corporations, and sometimes they get a little bit filtered on what they say, how they say it, etc. And now to get that more, raw and unfiltered view from social media, it's a breath of fresh air to see how this union labor movement is actually being looked at over the course of, historical events.
Yeah, and you so now you've kind of shifted your content a bit. You're not posting as much about the fandoms that you love because you can't, right? You want to not post about those. There's a certain list of properties or something, isn't there? A list of things that you can't promote, or how does that work?
Yeah, so the long short of it is it's anything that was shot on the 5 or 6 contracts that are being negotiated, so, which that gets a little deep in the weeds into union specifics. The easiest way to describe that is for most studio movies and television shows, or anything that was shot on or shot for a company that is in the AMPTP, which is honestly just about everything mainstream. Honestly,
Hollywood, basically Hollywood, right?
For the most part. I mean, there's independent Hollywood studios that are not a part of AMPTP, but it's a very short list compared to what is. Everything that was made by a major studio is more or less being treated as struck work right now. And those are the things that we don't want to discuss. Those are the things we don't want to promote. That's the reason you're not seeing actors on red carpets unless they're maybe the director as well, or producing as well, in which case there's a little bit of a gray area, unless it's overseas in a different market, which is a gray area. There's a lot of that. There was a lot of confusion when the strikes first started, of course. There was a lot of not uproar, but there was a lot of conversation when the strike first started as well, with influencers, because SAG has gotten into the influencer space as well. They have an influencer agreement contract, not unlike the other contracts we've discussed. Not that one is a part of this strike, but because that territory bleeds into things nowadays, especially now that social media is primarily video content.
Yeah.
They wanted to make sure that certain people, we're not hurting the cause if they could help it. So they're trying very hard to get information out there right away about, let's not promote struck work unless you're already on a contract. If you were on a contract that got signed beforehand, finish your job, do what you got to do, put out your contracted videos, and then be done for the duration of the strike, please. and that's how it's kind of been treated. But that also bled over into things like cosplay. And I understand. I mean, I'm primarily a charity cosplayer in groups like the NYC Ghostbusters and the Rebel Legion and the Northridge, but those are still a tacit promotion for the IP that we're cosplaying. That's an advertisement that the studios didn't have to pay for. And every group that I've been a part of has had a relationship with the studio that produced the work. So while the particular actions are for a good cause, they didn't want the union. I'm sorry, the union did not want their membership to promote work in that way. So I've been abstaining from cosplay. They're not saying for non-union members to not cosplay. They're not saying for non-union members to not talk about different things unless they choose that as a point of solidarity. They're not saying to the general public, don't ever talk about any of these movies, but they are making the studio's job harder, which is the main tactic of that, because now it's on the studio to put up those things.
Well, and it's not helping that like movie theaters are tanking and all the like everything. Nobody's going to the movies anymore. All the movies coming out this summer are just not doing well at all. So it's not looking good for the studios. I got to be honest. I have faith that you guys will be triumphant. I think that you guys will win or get like more out of this than I don't know. I think they have to give more way. They have to give up more of the profits. It's just the way it works.
I agree. I'm hopeful. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I am very hopeful. I mean, obviously, this is a very rich and powerful group of individuals who are in charge of these studios. They make literally millions of dollars a year, and their only job is to cut costs, raise profits, and point out all the things they did to do that to their shareholders. That's their job. And so it's very easy from their point of view to look at things in not dehumanizing, but in a term of more of a spreadsheet profit loss than in the human element. And we as artists are specializing primarily in the human element. So we're also philosophically a little bit at odds. It's also a very strange strike because, you know, the AMPTP, when they're not together negotiating these contracts, they're competitors.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking Netflix, Max, you know, Amazon, Paramount, all of these companies that don't usually work together now have to work together. We're all combined as artists, whether we're in a strike or not. We just have a cause to rally behind right now. But when this is done, we're just going to go back and be colleagues on set anyway. So there's no change of tactic for us. You know, meanwhile, they had to hire a crisis PR firm in order to try to save face. So they're very much losing the public opinion battle for sure.
Absolutely there. So what do you post about then? Is this what you're posting about on TikTok mostly? Is the strike?
It was for a little bit. I fell off of it a little bit because I realized there were so many other creators who were doing a better job of it than me. I also just was going through a lot of scrambling with trying to find employment, some related to the strike, some not. It's been a very tricky summer trying to make sure everything in the real life gets taken care of first. So that became priority for a little bit of the summer. So I did kind of back off on producing content at large for a little while. When that happened, I was primarily posting strike related content. I realized that was one, being covered, and two, not something I could make a priority for a little while. And then when I came back to a place where I could focus on creating content for TikTok again and other platforms, I realized that it was right around the release time for a project that I worked on a little bit earlier in the year before the strike. Not that it's impacted by the strike, thank goodness, because I can actually talk about this and not be in any kind of violation. But one of my good friends wrote a sci-fi novel in late 2021. And both myself and another one of his friends who had just gotten into audio producing both said, if you want to make an audiobook version of this book at some point, let me know. And so he kind of saw that confluence of events coming together and realized, well, I've got somebody who wants to narrate and I've got somebody who wants to produce it. Why don't we go try to make an audiobook? And so we did. So my friend decided that one of his novels called How We Stop the Destroyers, he decided he was going to make an audiobook version so more people could enjoy the book. And so this spring in April, we combined forces essentially and came together in his friend Terry's studio, up in the Catskills, a little bit far away from me in New York City. And we just spent a weekend essentially creating an audiobook and just kind of figuring out how to do it. Like, I had done a little bit of voice acting before. I haven't done a long form narration like this before, but it was so much fun to do. And Terry is a musician. He's originally from New York City. He had moved up to the Catskills with his wife during the pandemic, like many people did, and got into a lot of audio production. And he had just he had just assembled a recording booth inside that studio.
How long in total did it take you to do this?
That's a funny question, actually, because we tried to map that out ahead of time. We knew we had 3.5 days to record. We went up on a Friday. We did Friday through Sunday. I think we left Monday morning. We looked up online guessing what the usual estimates for that kind of a thing are. We guessed out, or we counted out how many words were in the print version of the book. And then by that estimate, we looked at a couple of calculations made by other people online saying that if you record for about 5 hours a day, you can get this done in 3 days. Well, it took a lot longer than 5 hours because, in fairness, this was my first time. And so I'm looking at this. I'm sitting in the darkened room. It's a closed off recording space. It's dark, beautiful. And then reading off of an iPad, so you don't hear the noise of the pages turning. So it's just all on a tablet, just using my finger to scroll to the next page. So it's very quiet, other than the voice reading the text. But I would often have to do a second take. Like if I stumbled on a word, if I read something wrong, if something just made me laugh, we would joke with each other all the time. And there were a couple of times I'm very proud of that I actually made the author laugh, because it's his work. So he knows the words that are coming. He's also reading along as I'm narrating outside of the booth to make sure that everything is kind of essentially quality controlled. And he was also there to just make sure, we were on point. If a voice sounded off from what he thought it might sound like, making sure pronunciations were correct, all that sort of, oversight. But there were a couple of times I got him to laugh at his own words. So I was very proud of that.
Did you do voices for the different characters?
I did.
Yeah?
I did
Okay.
a different voice for every character in this book. And that was about, I think we counted out to just shy of 30 principal characters that were, repeating throughout the story here and there. And then a handful of other little characters that maybe just had like a line or were in one chapter or something. So somewhere between 35 and 40 different voices on top of the narration. So the narration would just be in my regular reading voice, and then it would just jump to a different character. I'm a big fan of the Star Wars audiobooks, and for people who enjoy that or in that space might be familiar with the narrator Mark Thompson, who is, I've had the pleasure of getting to know him a little bit since living in New York City. He is one of the sweetest individuals ever, an incredibly talented voice actor. And he narrates a lot, not all, but a lot of the Star Wars books. And he'll do a voice for every single character. And it is a production. And I tried very hard to emulate that or take influence from that. And so that was the goal, was to have a unique voice for every single character. And that alone is a little bit of a challenge, because sometimes you're coming up on a new character. You didn't really plan what they would sound like yet. So you kind of in real time have to just figure out, what voice can I do that I haven't done yet? And by voice 30, it's a little tricky.
And then you have to remember if that character comes back, what you just decided in the spur of the moment, right?
Yes. Although the wonderful thing about having Terry, who is a fantastic audio producer, there were a couple of times where I forgot what voice I used for a character. Like I knew that character was in a previous chapter, but I just couldn't remember. Like it was the next day. Thankfully, he's able to go back in the recordings and go through the playback. But, that's extra time spent. And we had to do that 2 or 3 times just to help with the recall. I did ask Andrew, the author, to make a list for me of the characters, as well as how those names are pronounced, which, because it's science fiction, everything has a slightly different, unique spin on things. And there are words that are not necessarily familiar. There's a lot of aliens in this book, per se, or for example. So there were a lot of names that are different collections of vowels and consonants that, or pronounced with weird syllables. There's a couple names that I would even look at it in the text and I would not have pronounced it the way that Andrew wrote out to say it.
Mhm.
So I'm glad I had that as a reference, but I also started jotting down notes next to each name, what my kind of inspiration was for each voice. And some things were a silly impression of a famous person. Some were just dumb little memes that I remembered and just kind of reminded me of a voice or a sound that it just kind of got me into that place to do that voice again. Sometimes I was legitimately just gesturing in the booth by myself, just sitting on my little stool and, arms out, like swaying in the breeze, because that created a very gentle and flowing and melodic voice. And that became one of the aliens later on in the story. So anytime that character came up, I would raise my arms and kind of just float through the not moving, but just swaying on my stool while reading the voices. And so that's just little tricks that just got my, voice in the right place, just using every other tool that I could. Thankfully, no one saw it because it's just the audio recordings, so it worked
Yeah.
out very well. But it's interesting to see what tools in the toolbox from other elements of acting make their way into voice acting somewhere.
Well, it sounds like a lot of fun. I bet you're a lot better at it now than when you started.
I would say so.
Yep.
We started on a Friday. By Sunday, I was very much flying through everything. We ended up doing about 8 hours a day. So it ended up
Wow.
being about 24, 25 hours of recording to get this book done.
Mm.
So, and it's not the largest book. It's about, I think in print, it's about 230, 240 pages or so.
Hmm.
But it's still, it took its time. And there were things we had to re-record. There were things we weren't sure what to do. We took a lot of breaks. I went through a lot of lozenges and water and nasal spray because we were also doing this in the springtime, and I have allergies, and we
Mm.
were in the Catskills. Coming from the city to the Catskills and then trying to do something was a fascinating exercise in, can Bryan breathe okay today?
Let alone read chapters of a novel. Jeez. Where's the book available? Can you just download it on Audible or something?
We will be able to download it on Audible. It will be available on pretty much every audiobook platform later on in September.
Oh, okay.
We are getting it. We have it submitted right now to our distributor. That got approved, and so that is being sent out to the various retailer sites. That includes Audible, Spotify, a couple of library services, although I do think individual libraries will need to order it.
Mhm.
I believe it will be on Kobo, it'll be on Apple. So whatever your audiobook platform of choice is, there will be an option for you to listen to the book.
Well, that's awesome. And I'll put the link in the description so people can find it and listen to it and listen to all your voices. Isn't it cool that people, like just anybody, can do this kind of thing? Like you can, your friend can write a novel and publish it and have people enjoy it. It seems like this is stuff that was so out of reach for us when we were younger, right? Like it was like, how would you possibly get a novel published? How could you possibly do this, right?
Yeah, it's really wild to think about this nowadays. Like I remember being in high school and college, and that was really right around the time of for us sci-fi nerds, like the fan film boom.
Oh,
Like it was
yes.
just that first time when people were getting into having a video camera, having, Adobe Premiere or whatever, cheap nonlinear editing program they could acquire, and going out and making a movie for the first time ever, not knowing what you're doing and just jamming. And it had that kind of indie rock and roll vibe to it where we're just trying to figure out how to do this while we do it. It brought me back to that era so much. And it's just so wonderful that that technology is at a place where not only are we able to do it, but we're able to do it really well now. Like Terry is also a very good audio producer. He's been a musician. He's done a lot of things. He knows his craft very well. It's wonderful that he has that and invested into that. But he also hadn't done a long form narration project before. And he did so much stuff in post. That was his first time figuring that out too. And just the fact that those tools are so readily available now to make that happen, and that you can just walk in, take a book into a room, record with your microphone, process it, get all the times I tripped and coughed and sneezed and swore at the author for making an awkward word, and out of love. But editing all those flubs out and then putting out a product on Audible next to very professionally produced media, it's insane to me. Like,
But
when I was a kid, this never would have happened.
no, but because the barriers are coming down, right? And this is the problem, going back to the studios that they're facing, because people are consuming that media alongside the big media. People will read a novel published by your friend and then go buy the latest best Tom Clancy bestseller, whatever. It's all equal now. It's all equal media that people can enjoy. And the studios don't have as much control as they used to, right? That's a huge issue. So it's a shifting world. It's exciting. I think it's going to end up being we're going to have another indie film boom out of this whole thing, right? That's going to happen for sure. Because who's making movies right now? Independent studios, right? So that's going to be fun to watch. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting times for sure. But I'm excited to see what comes next. I think there's a lot of possibilities out there for all kinds of artists.
I would agree very much. It's really wonderful to see for those who are paying attention and are willing to kind of figure out how to go about it. It doesn't just have to be, this low budget, low quality piece anymore. Like you said, you can make something that's literally on the same quality level as the major studios that are putting something out now. All you have to do is learn how to do it, get the right people, and, have faith.
Yeah. Well, Bryan, thank you so much for your time. And I promise we'll come have you back on. We can actually talk about the things that we like to talk about. I was like, I guess we shouldn't nerd out over Ahsoka. Okay, fine, I won't talk about it. But that kind of stuff would be in Star Trek. Of course, I've been watching Star Trek for the last 2 years. It's just amazing. Anyway, not talking about it. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being my TikTok friend.
It's my pleasure, Dan. Thank you so much. I look forward to the days when we can talk about the other things, hopefully very soon.
There you have it. What a great guy. And again, Bryan, I'm so sorry it took me so long to post that, but I am happy that it is now out there and people can hear about your experience recording that awesome audiobook that I am so enjoying. I listen to it at night. It's kind of my bedtime ritual now. I listen to it like a chapter or two before I go to sleep. It's really turned me around on audiobooks, I got to say, because I wasn't really listening to audiobooks a lot until I downloaded this one, and now I'm back into it. So very cool stuff. Again, that book is called How We Stopped the Destroyers, and it is available wherever you get your audiobooks. Thank you so much to my guest, Bryan Patrick Stoyle, for being on the podcast. Thank you so much to you for listening to this podcast. And I'm so excited to be doing this again. I can't wait to talk to all of my TikTok friends and to share those conversations with the rest of the world. That's going to do it for this episode. Come on back next week when I'll introduce you to another one of my TikTok friends.